Welcome to Military Analytics. The Ukrainian war continues to affect the basic policies of the countries of the world on international politics and military balance. The most powerful factor shaping these policies is the USA, one of Ukraine's most important allies. You know that the US administration is now fighting not only against the threat of Russia, but also against the expansionist policies of China, which is trying to blockade Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific maritime areas. In this complex cycle, the USA, Russia and China mutually carried out many military activities in the sea areas, in areas such as the Sea of Japan, the Pacific, and the Arctic Ocean. Russia tried to take Ukraine's invasion plans to global dimensions in the Indo-Pacific by disturbing Taiwan. China showed its support for Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. Against all this, the USA carried out deterrent military naval exercises in the strategic sea areas we mentioned in order to prevent both countries from creating a new global crisis. Despite the US's efforts to prevent it, China continues its policies of supporting Russia in the Ukraine war. While the last move of the Biden administration caused the Beijing administration to take a step back, the Biden administration has directly warned China not to provide military aid to Russia. This striking step went down in history as the clearest warning of the USA to China. After little more than a year of careful and repeated consideration, China weighed the costs and benefits and bowed to the US threat. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang, at a press conference with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who visited Germany, stated that China has adopted a prudent and responsible stance on the export of military product and that the Beijing administration will no longer supply weapons to the relevant parties of the Ukrainian conflict. In addition, Xinjiang added that he will manage the export of dual-use products in accordance with laws and regulations. After critical statements, this was described to the world media as a successful example of the US's use of coercive diplomacy to deter China from providing military aid to Russia. In other words, Russian leader Putin has now lost his most trusted ally. In fact, we have been communicating this to you from the very beginning. The alliance between Russia and China was entirely by a thread. It was obvious for a long time that the solidarity of these two countries was based on a relationship of interest. The whole world faced this reality with the warning of the USA to China. In fact, the U.S. first warning came during a meeting of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in March 2022 with Yang Jiechi, the then director of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Foreign Relations Commission, just a few months after this warning. Blinken repeated it at the 2023 Munich Security Conference. A senior State Department official who was aware of the actual conversation said that Blinken had given a rather blunt warning about the implications and consequences of China's financial support to Russia. Similarly, the reading of Blinken's September 2022 meeting showed Wang conveying to Wang that the United States is open to cooperation with the PRC where interests intersect. In short, Washington's consistent warnings to Beijing seem to have worked. Will China stick to this policy before addressing this? It is worth mentioning two preliminary observations. First, no embargo lasts forever. So Chinese technology on the battlefield would eventually materialize no matter what. Indeed, declassified information released by the Biden administration in late February 2023 indicated that China's dual-use navigation, radar drone, and electronic communications jamming equipment had reached the Russian military. But right now, China's move away from Russia and its declaration that it will no longer support Moscow for the Ukraine war has changed the balance. Second, China had reasons to provide military aid. In Beijing's eyes, it had saved $35.8 billion in security aid to Ukraine's war effort against Russia, according to the US's own State Department figures. In such a clash, China also wanted to seize this opportunity. But the warnings of the USA did not allow China to enter the Russian market. However, as sympathetic as Beijing may be to Moscow, Qin Gang's statement highlights that China has even more compelling reasons to exercise restraint. Accordingly, Beijing will not provide the necessary military assistance to Moscow to turn the tide of the war, unless the very survival of the Putin regime is at stake. In general, China's policy is determined by a political logic. Therefore, China's restriction created by the warnings of the USA will probably continue. There are three specific political reasons for this. First, Beijing understands both the dangers of an escalation of the war in Ukraine and the risk of Chinese entanglement. Chinese policymakers avoid engaging in a conflict that would anger the West, and harm China's own national interests. Also, China is now recognizing the importance of balancing the conflicting imperatives of helping Russia. Also, Russia's military performance in Ukraine has generated highly critical internal commentary in China's strategic studies community. Chinese strategists understand that in order to change the military outcome in Ukraine in favor of Moscow, a politically untenable level of military support should not be provided. Second, decisive military assistance to Russia will inevitably trigger economic sanctions from Brussels and Washington, jeopardizing China's economic growth prospects. The CCP's domestic political legitimacy is based on its ability to provide a sustained return to strong economic growth, which itself will also be based on continued trade with the EU and the US, especially in the post-coronavirus pandemic era. The EU and the US became the two largest trading partners, representing 13.7% and 12.5% respectively of China's trade in 2021. However, there is much more to the trade volume. European technology is becoming more and more critical to the quality of China's economic development. So Beijing relies on Europe as a reliable source of alternative technology. This fact promoted Wang Yi to the post of director of the CCP Central Committee on Foreign Relations in January 2023. According to Wang, what efforts should be made to stop the war must be adjusted to European interests. So Putin has already been eliminated by China for economic reasons. Thirdly, and lastly, China seems intent on projecting a more positive image of itself in world politics, especially after the coronavirus pandemic. In February this year, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published two important documents. The first was a systematic critique of U.S. hegemony, emphasizing the claim that Washington abused its power to maximize its political, military, economic, technological, and cultural interests. The latter was more positive, outlining Beijing's Global Security Initiative, a Chinese alternative to the U.S. model of world politics. In the current situation, China's decision to provide military support to Russia will undermine the GSI, causing many states to see Beijing as a facilitator of hegemonic behavior that criticized the U.S. Therefore, China had to step back. As a result, the U.S. policy of deterrence was successful in China's military assistance to Russia. Beijing will maintain diplomatic and economic support to Russia, but will try to limit military support. The reasons for the continuation of this policy reflect a combination of factors. The dangers of China's military allegiance to Russia are a cause for concern that military aid to Russia will trigger economic sanctions from Brussels and Washington, and given China's imperative to improve its international image. The US did a good job by openly warning China, except in the unlikely scenario of Putin's fall, Beijing will not provide Moscow with the military capabilities it needs. Apparently, Russia has to make do with what it has. The negative impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the dominant power of the Russian army reverberates 1,700 kilometers from the front line. Moscow's shrinking strategic bandwidth and dwindling capacity in the Middle East and Syria, crushed by its strategic blunder, disrupted the complex power dynamics of the conflict with the use of Iranian-made weapons on the Ukrainian fronts by the Russian armies. The basic balance stones in the Middle East began to move. Until now, Israel has been supporting Ukraine from the shadows and has been applying a balanced policy with Russia for its strategic interests. However, Russia's extreme military cooperation and rapprochement with Iran, as well as following the Iran-backed Hezbollah group to increase its activities in Syria, shifts Israel's pursuit to the Ukrainian side of the balanced strategy. Also, while the tactical shift in Russia's military footprint in Syria is relatively minor, realigning power dynamics on the ground is far more important. An opportunistic Iran, which uses its tactical advantage on the ground while deepening its strategic ties with Russia, and a conflicting Israel hovering in a dangerous balance between its interest in Syria and its support for Ukraine and the West are at the forefront. Iran's offensive tactics may be on the rise as Russia's capacity in Syria dwindles to fill the security gaps that have emerged, especially in southwestern Syria, a region of strategic importance for Israel. Israel blames Iran for increasingly using Syrian airports to transport advanced weapons to its Lebanese ally, Hezbollah. We have seen concrete examples of Israel's accusations against Iran by repeatedly hitting Syrian air bases. Let's take a look at the latest and heaviest ever airstrike by Israel on key facilities used to supply drones to the Russian army by Iranian-backed groups in Damascus. The last of these attacks occurred the other day in the suburb of Kfar Sousa. 4 Special F-16 tactical jets of the Israeli Air Force launched a missile attack on Damascus from Golan Heights. It has been reported that the heavy airstrike of Israel F-16s targeted the area that is home to high-level security officials, security units, intelligence headquarters, and Iranian facilities in a high-security area of the Syrian capital of Damascus. Many buildings were damaged in the densely populated area, with multi-story security buildings in residential areas close to the Umayyad Square in central Damascus. In addition, Israel targeted a meeting of Syrian and Iranian experts on drone production with this airstrike. The meeting was held at an Iranian military base in the basement of a residential building inside a security compound. We learned that among those killed as a result of the attacks is a civil engineer working in the Scientific Studies and Research Center in the Syrian Army, which is related to Syria's chemical weapons program. An engineer of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Army who was also involved in Iran's missile development was seriously injured in the attack and was sent to a hospital in Tehran for treatment. The main reason why Israel targeted Iranian kamikaze drone experts with this attack is to intimidate Russia. As we all know, Russia has frequently used Iranian-made drones in the Ukraine war. Israel took action upon the active use of Iranian drones in the Ukraine war. Israeli F-16 fighter jets destroyed the building where the drone experts were gathered. With this attack attempt, both Iran and Russia were incurably wounded. Russia, which became famous for its failures in the Ukraine war, was also humiliated in the face of Israel. In addition, Israel once again emphasized that it openly supports Ukraine with its attack. The interruption of the production of Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles, which destroyed the Ukrainian cities and paralyzed civilian life, will undoubtedly relieve the Kiev administration. On the other hand, the Israeli Defense Forces did not comment on the Kfar Sousa attack in line with its policy of generally not commenting on airstrikes in the country. Israeli officials have previously stated that the IDF does not target civilians and tries to avoid damaging residential areas as much as possible. The Syrian Air Force Command claimed that it managed to intercept most of the missiles launched over the Golan Heights by IAF jets in the attack. While military analysts are skeptical of such claims, Syria claims it regularly intercepts Israeli missiles. Footage from northern Israel showed a Syrian air defense missile detonating over the Golan Heights. Israel, so to speak, made a show of strength with its attacks targeting drone experts. Iran's foreign ministry condemned the attack, but did not mention any Iranian casualties. It was also publicly condemned as a violation of international law by Russia, which, like Iran, is an important supporter of the Syrian regime in the civil war that's been going on for more than a decade. In another development, an Israeli military official said in recent weeks that the IDF will not hesitate to attack if Iran sends weapons to its proxies in the region under the guise of humanitarian aid to Syria after the major earthquake in the region. Several cargo planes carrying aid to Iran have landed in Syria since a major earthquake hit the country and areas in southeast Turkey on February 6. In recent years, several airstrikes on Iranian arms shipments allegedly disguised as seemingly harmless products have been attributed to Israel, including one incident last month. It is generally believed that relatively large weapons were smuggled through Syria by Iranian cargo airlines that frequently land at Damascus International Antias, or for air base outside the city of Palmyra in central Syria. The weapons are believed to have been stored in warehouses in the area before being transported to Lebanon. Separately, Israeli jets targeted Iranian and Syrian regime military sites near Damascus International Airport as well as Sid Zainab and Al-Kiswa, a town and city just south of the capital. Let's take a closer look at the Russia, Iran, Israel triangle. Russia is not pulling out of Syria. Nevertheless, the Wagner Group had to join forces, withdrawing some of its mercenaries and withdrawing from parts of southwestern and far eastern Syria. Russia has also redeployed a Syria-based S-300 air defense system to Ukraine. Russia and Iran have also deepened their strategic ties far beyond their cooperation in Syria. Iran has provided Russia with drones in its war with Ukraine, and an unprecedented defense partnership is developing. The two countries are also trying to build a bulwark against the West by cooperating, innovating sanctions, trying to expand their economic ties and deepening their ideological kinship stemming from their opposition to the US-led international order. The emerging strategic alliance between Russia and Iran poses a significant threat to US interests. At the same time, Moscow's ties with Iran will be somewhat limited due to Russia's desire to deepen its ties with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, as well as to manage its relations with Israel and Turkey. These developments add new urgency to efforts to create a regional security architecture. The United States is seeking a long-term strategy that addresses the threat posed by deepening Russian and Iranian security cooperation, including drones, ballistic missiles, and even strategic weapons. With a possible failure of the Iran nuclear deal and the specter of deepening Russia and Iranian defense cooperation, the Iranian threat to U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq and the threat of Iranian elements in Syria to Israel now must be addressed more comprehensively. A central command's evolving counter-drone efforts could precede a more robust response to this evolving threat. The Russian invasion of Ukraine created a gap between Russia and Israel. Tensions between the two countries have provoked an escalating military dynamic in Syria. Outraged by Moscow's stance on Israel's Ukraine issue, and despite Israel's efforts to adopt a balanced position, it fired S-300 missiles at Israeli jets in Syrian airspace in May 2022. This move by Russia signaled to Israel that Russia could disrupt long-standing security. Israel felt compelled to respond to Iran's opportunist tactics in Syria in light of Russia's looser control. It has launched bolder attacks than ever to demonstrate its determination to protect its security interests while utilizing Russia's dwindling capacities. Israel has sown the seeds of fear by launching airstrikes on Syrian territory many times. The war on the territory of Ukraine is approaching its first year and is inflaming again very seriously. While Russia and Ukraine have struggled for supremacy against each other under the fierce conflicts, the conflicts mostly affect the civilian population of the two countries. After the bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge, Russia targeted Ukraine's infrastructure, facilities, and civilian settlements. Its purpose was to break the resistance of the Ukrainian people and army, deprive them of basic needs, and make them surrender. Of course, this plan of the Russian army also fell through. Like its previous plans, no one expected such a solid defense from Ukraine, but the Ukrainian defense troops officially surrounded the country with an iron curtain against Russian attacks. State-of-the-art air defense systems from Western countries easily thwarted Russian missile and kamikaze UAV attacks. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, responded to these treacherous attacks of Russia by fighting in the private field with the right intelligence and the right strategy. The Ukrainian offensive units supported by Western intelligence successfully concluded every operation, and as a result, the Russian army began to lose between 400 and 800 casualties per day. The great offensive launched by the Ukrainian army towards the south last autumn was reflected in other fronts and increased the motivation of the army. After the Ukrainian army began to dominate the Russian army on almost every front, it set a single and final target, which is definitely the Crimea. Contrary to popular belief, Russia's invasion of Ukraine did not begin in February 2022. But in March 2014, mass protests broke out in Ukraine when the Russian-backed Ukrainian government at the time suspended Ukraine's accession process to the European Union. Unable to withstand protests, the Russian-backed government fell, and the newly arrived independent government enacted decisions bounded by the previous government, including Ukraine's NATO membership. Since the ports of Crimea and Sevastopol are Russia's only connection with the warm seas. When a government that they did not support came to power, they did not want the Crimean coast to embrace the NATO Navy and occupied Crimea. Now the advanced weapons of the West and the Ukrainian army, which has been trained by countries such as the USA and UK, are close to their final goal after the liberation of Kherson from the Russian occupation. A retired U.S. Army lieutenant general has claimed that Ukraine could recapture the precious Crimean Peninsula from Russia within months. As Vladimir Putin saw his defenseless troops being forced to retreat, Putin was dealt a devastating blow when a massive explosion caused parts of the Kerch Bridge between Crimea and Russia to collapse. Crimea is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and numerous military airfields and bases, and is also critical to the operational and logistical support of Russia's southern front in Ukraine. Putin blamed Kiev for this attack and described it as a terrorist attack. But retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former U.S. Army's European commander, explained how Vladimir Zelensky's forces could deliver a decisive blow that would go a long way toward recapturing Crimea. Hodges says that Ukraine, although at a significant cost, can actually hold Russia back. They can focus on building a large armored force. You will see an important move to help isolate the decisive region, the Crimea. Once they can take the Crimea, other things can wait and follow. A decisive blow would be to isolate Crimea. Lieutenant Hodges is confident that Ukraine will be able to retake Crimea by the end of next August and attack critical Russian infrastructure around the peninsula, undermining Russia's ability to do anything. Hodges says that Ukraine could retake Crimea by the end of next August. There are two roads connecting Crimea to the mainland, and if you can separate them with long-range fire, then Crimea will increasingly look like a trap. Then you can start hitting the very vulnerable Russian infrastructure on the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian army will go after Russian headquarters and infrastructure, neutralizing this Russian advantage. Ukraine was very wise to go after various headquarters, transport and ammunition storage facilities. When you start shooting these, you really undermine Russia's ability to do anything. When asked how he believes the next few months of war will turn out, Lieutenant General Hodges says that Ukraine will launch an armed-led offensive to isolate Crimea. If they get what they need in terms of long-range weapons and can assemble sufficiently armored formations, both Ukrainian, captive Russians and Western, they will have the combat power to beat what I mostly see as long lines. Meanwhile, very striking Ukrainian operations are taking place at the front as Vladimir Putin continues to struggle to make gains in the war. Numerous Russian armored vehicles were blown up in a series of devastating Ukrainian attacks. Ukrainian armed forces released footage of precision strikes using anti-tank guided missiles to destroy large numbers of Russian tanks trying to advance in the Donetsk region. President Putin's men suffered a humiliating failure when forces from Ukraine's 72nd Mechanized Brigade targeted Russian tanks south of the city of Pavlivka. It was filmed that at least 4 Russian tanks were destroyed during the attack. In a separate clip of the same attacks, a Russian BMP-3 tank burst into flames as it made its way to reach a tree line to advance. The clip showed several burning tanks filling the front line at Pavlivka after Russian troops were forced to retreat despite throwing tanks and men into battle to take Pavlivka. Current reports indicate that Russian forces have not yet entered the city, and most of the fighting is still stuck in the suburbs. The Ukrainian armed forces later confirmed that it had repelled multiple Russian attacks on 11 settlements in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The eruption coincided with a massive barrage of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine that killed at least 11 people. However, to the disappointment of President Putin, all Russian kamikaze drones were shot down, while 47 out of 70 rockets were shot down. The last offensive, which was stopped, came a few days after the Russian armed forces announced that they had launched a new offensive in the Zaporizhia region. On the other hand, retired Colonel Richard Kemp, who has served in the UK Army for nearly 30 years, has warned that Putin could be hit by a Russian coup and face a very bleak future unless he achieves a major war victory soon. The Russian president may step up efforts to win the war on the first anniversary of the conflict, with reports that he may be prepared to mobilize 500,000 troops into battle. The mobilization, announced last fall, failed miserably as thousands of Russians tried to flee the country. This is the strongest sign that even his own people are turning against Putin because of the war. Colonel Kemp says that there is still conflict on all fronts between Russia and Ukraine. But at the moment there is a relative inactivity as both sides prepare major attacks in the coming weeks and possibly months. Putin is mobilizing his forces, preparing to send them to Ukraine, some of whom are already there to give him the crucial support he needs more than ever to smash the Ukrainian army. This could be Putin's final roll of the dice. The Ukrainians took a big hit, but of course, so did Putin. We all know that things are not going as we expected or how he has conditioned the Russian people. So if he can make it through, he should have a major victory earlier this year. However, Colonel Kemp warned that the failure to achieve such a victory would be disastrous for Putin and would be a coup to overthrow the Russian president from power. Richard Kemp says that if Putin fails to achieve this important victory, there could be a very bleak future for him, with a possibility of some kind of coup d'état against him in Russia. He will be very wary of this possibility. Despite this war, Putin is still in a very strong position and enjoys great popularity with Russia. However, we have also seen rumors from some elites in Russia, for example, from the head of the Wagner Group. The probability of a popular Russian uprising against Putin is extremely low. But the likelihood that someone important or a significant number of people in Moscow will take action against him is possible.